Yo, not here, and yes, it is the Phase 2 loot bias video. It's going to be long, but I'll do my best to get through it without too much slowness, and we're here in Nagrand in a really wonderful spot, which you'll see the value to, I presume, in the scope of this video, just as a little addition. Just as a quick disclaimer before we get underway, this is not the only factor. I can't know if Jimmy hasn't had an upgrade for 4 weeks or that Timmy is a goddamn slacker. It's not the scope of this video. The only context I can feasibly discuss with you is the spec they play and the loot value to that spec. So take everything with a pinch of salt, use it as a tiebreaker rather than gospel. With that out the way, let's get stuck in with SSC and Hydross. And right away, we've got Robe of Hateful Echoes. At first glance, it's just a great item, right? Pretty solid. The big thing here, though, is that it's exceptionally close to Elemental Shaman Bis, whilst being pretty good for all the other specs that are in the vestments of the Sea Witch waiting room. Now, we're going to see what those specs are later on, but just to go through real quick, the value of this robe is because the hit rating on vestments of the Sea Witch is effectively dead on Elemental Shamans. This is exceptionally close to vestments. So this, to my mind, is an aggressive prio to your elemental or elementals in your raid group. It's just really good for them. Alongside this, your shadow-based warlocks will probably be able to use this pretty well until they get their hands on vestments of the Sea Witch. But again, spoiler alert, their claim to vestments is a bit higher, quite a bit higher. So keep that in mind. And overall, this is pretty much going to go to your elementals first, and then anyone who can kind of utilize it as a nice upgrade. Wraps of Purification. Most healers are going to view these as a downgrade compared to the Keepers of Time Bracers, whilst all healers have better options from other bosses, so go anywhere here. More of a catch-up item. Boots of Shifting Nightmare. These are roughly equal to Shadow Weave boots, provided the shadow-based caster needs the hit. So basically you're looking at your shadow locks that don't have Frozen Shadow Weave or want the extra hit to make their gearing time easier. Shadow Priest can use these, but the hit is pretty hard to factor in. So now we're on to shoulder pads of the Stranger, and you may have heard about these ones already. They're pretty high value, pretty high contestation. And before I get into this real quick, this is a loose priority here. Other merits are probably more impactful here. Obviously I put the disclaimer at the start of the video, but in this kind of case where the item is pretty high value, it's more than fair to use way different factors other than class and spec. So, these are Bis for Rep Paladins, Enhanced Shamans, likely DPS warriors, but it's pretty close. They do form part of one of the best setups for rogues. There's 2 Bis rogue setups essentially, and this factors into one of them. There's an important caveat to this item though. Expertise as a stat rounds down based on 3.94 rating per 1 expertise on your character sheet. So as an example, if you had 3 expertise rating, you'd actually gain nothing, no expertise on your character sheet. And for some specs, shoulder pads of the Stranger have close competitors that mean you'd need to not get any rounding down on the overall expertise on these shoulders for them to actually be better than the second best option, if that makes sense. Essentially, if you can't maximize most of the 10 expertise rating on these shoulders into actual expertise on the character sheet, they fall behind the second best option for both warriors and rogues, at least to my understanding, because they have very good options in tier 5 shoulders, and as such it'd be a massive ball ache to actually calculate people's expertise, which you could do so if you wish, but as a general statement I would lean towards Enhanced and Ret tier, whose second best options are comfortably below shoulder pads of the Stranger, and thus rounding down will not cause them to be below the second best option at any stage of phase 2 gearing. A very important note though is that from a raid perspective, you want your Enhanced to hold on to the 2-piece tier 4 bonus as long as possible, which typically involves shoulders. A lot of Enhanced Shamans after a few weeks converged on the assumption or the knowledge that shoulders form part of the best two-piece setup. So if you're asking them to hold on to it, you may want to go Ret Paladin first here, but either way, Ret and Enhance are very good picks here as your first priority. Now, on top of this, rogues have a setup that is basically equivalent to a shoulder pads of the Stranger setup that uses Bloodsea Brigand's Vest as the 5th piece alongside 4-piece tier 5. I would therefore put rogues behind warriors, since Bloodsea is not as contested as these shoulders and is a very good item for rogues. As Alliance, this is even more compelling as far as min-maxing on class goes, thanks to the human racial pushing them close to soft cap without too much help. As a quick note though, Feral Druids should be nowhere near this. They use tier 5 4-piece with wolf heads as their DPS set, or they'll use Searing Grip or Deafness in the glove slot if they're tanking and want a little bit extra of juice. To summarise my personal thoughts on the priority, Ret and Enhance are at the top, though you probably lean Ret if the Enhance is still using 2-piece tier 4 and doesn't have the replacement ready to go in other slots, followed by Warrior, followed by Rogue. But between the 3 specs you want to give this to, it's more than reasonable to forgo class priority and go on other merits. Nobody is going to be super upset if you give these to, say, a really big Fury Warrior that's blasting and it actually turns out that he can use all of the expertise, etc. So just keep that in mind, but I would lean Ret and Enhance here. Black Fathom Warbands. These are sick, essentially. Bis for Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin. The upgrade over Windhawk is smaller for Holy Pala than Resto Shaman if they happen to have them, so maybe slightly leaning towards that Resto Shaman prio, but generally it's just Bis for both, so either works. Okay, so Ranger General's Chest Guard is a pretty decent item, but can generally go anywhere where it's a big upgrade. If hit is not needed by your Retribution Paladin, this is actually the best chest piece they can use. So it's probably best put there regardless, given the general lack of interest elsewhere. But I will say though, Retribution Paladins are typically aiming for tier 5 or Krakenheart Breastplate and dropping hit elsewhere. But Ret is definitely the best recipient for this as you head into early Phase 2 raid weeks. Bright Helm of Justice is pretty much a Void Crystal most of the time. It's more of a catch-up item. The lack of a meta gem is pretty problematic, but it's not awful. It's okay. So if it is an upgrade, awesome. Just your Holy Paladin, obviously. Pauldrons of the War Dancer. Now these are, again, one of those items that offer a very good alternative to Shoulder Pads of the Stranger for warriors in particular, but also they're not too bad on Ret Pallies too, of course. So overall, it doesn't matter which ones you go with here. You're probably going to go for tier 5 shoulders a little bit higher on your warriors compared to your Rets. But overall, it's just one of those stopgap items that are close but not quite there. This moves us on to Ring of Lethality, and this ring is quite contested. It's Bis for Rogues and Enhanced Shaman, and probably Feral, but there is some question marks over whether you can switch around for the stats ring that we'll see later on. But generally those are the 3 specs that really want this ring, and I would lean Rogue here just because of the sheer amount of hit they consistently need, but I wouldn't think too hard based on class here. Just ensure that your Rogues and Enhance are slightly ahead of others, because other specs have better ring combinations that don't contain this one, or if this is Bis for them, it's very close, as in the case of Feral. This moves us to Band of Vile Aggression. It's not a PV item, so it can go anywhere. It's probably a Void Crystal more often than not though. Living Root of the Wild Heart is pretty much a Void Crystal too. It's just a bad proc for all specs and forms of Druid. It's just not that good. It can be okay for balance if you're really, whipping out a fresh boomkin, but honestly, it's pretty bad. Scarab of Displacement. Now, this is okay. It's best suited to your Paladin if they need the extra defense, but this is not going to feature in any Bis setups, so just give it to whoever wants it really, but I can't imagine the demand is too high. This brings us to Fathom-Stone now, and it's a very good offhand, but not too far ahead of the badge vendor offhands. The notable exception being the fire-based offhand from the badge vendor, which is ever so slightly better than this. As such, you're not going to give this to your main spec fire mages or your main spec fire warlocks, whilst I would give a very slight prio to your elemental shaman over arcane and the shadow boys, because the crit is even more valuable to them than knapsack or the badge shield. So it's very close. It can go to pretty much anyone that isn't fire based, because the fire offhand is really good from badges, but I would give a tiny leaning towards elemental if we're talking just spec. Idol of the Crescent Goddess, it's just not good enough. Simple as that. It's a void crystal 99.9% of the time. You might get some value from it if you have a second Resto Druid that's spamming regrowth as opposed to using, the standard life bloom rotations, but overall this is just not where you want to be. And this brings us to the Lurker Below. First things first is that Call of Screaming Terrors is a great belt, but it's mostly a placeholder until that caster crafts Belt of Blasting. This is a BOE that is crafted with a raid drop pattern, which uses nether vortexes. It is essentially just really far ahead of all the other options, but this isn't too bad. So it's pretty good, but I wouldn't give a class-based prio because pretty much all casters use Belt of Blasting. Now we're on to Velvet Boots of the Guardian, and they are great. For most casters, they are worse than Boots of Blasting, but they do require tailoring to craft and then to equip because they are bind on pickup. As such, they are the best on non-tailor Boomkins Arcane Mages, but in particular, these are straight bis for your Elemental Shamans, just outright bis for Elemental. So you will go there first, but other than Elemental, you're looking at non-tailors and particularly Boomkin and Arcane Mages who get a little bit of value out of that spirit. It's pretty typical though for your mages to be tailors, so you're probably going like Elemental Shaman, Boomkin, and whoever else needs them, because most people are going to be getting Boots of Blasting. Now we're on to Grove Band of Remulos. Resto Druid bis, but not too amazing for Resto Shaman or Holy Pala who want the Hydross braces. As such, it's just Resto Druid all day. This brings us to Boots of Effortless Striking, and these are essentially a void crystal unless there's some PvP applications for the high stamina. Tempest Strider boots are not dreadful, but they are not as good as Forest Lord Striders, Kazakh boots, or Orca Hide boots that we're going to see from Leotheros in just a moment. So, more of a catch-up item, Resto Shaman, Holy Pala. Simple. Speaking of catch-up items, this is essentially the same thing, but a lot worse. It's got a lot of crit, which might be appealing to the crit fiends amongst the Holy Pala community, but the low healing is a real bummer. No gem sockets. It's mostly a void crystal, but can be serviceable if you've got a fresh Holy Pala. Braces of Eradication. Really good braces. The hit is sometimes problematic for arms and ret as they cap so easily, so you're best going Fury first here because they can always utilize the extra hit even if they're soft capped. Following that, ret or arms, same value provided they need the hit rating. A quick note though, Ret Palas are going to use the Phase 1 braces as their bis, and I believe arms probably too, but potentially arms will use these. But Ret Palis definitely more interested in the High King Mulgar braces. I think they're High King Mulgar. Those are going to be their bis, so maybe arms ahead depending on how that shakes out. Warriors are still a little bit slacking at the time of recording on their simulations and bis lists, but overall Fury first here, 100%. This brings us to Choker of Animalistic Fury. Solid neck, but behind the Karathress neck and the Trash SSC neck for prospective recipients. Pendant of the Perilous from Trash is essentially, a similar item. So if you're not getting lucky with that, you're going to basically copy paste the prio from Pendant of the Perilous when we get there to this one, which is essentially your Rets and your Warriors first. But overall, if you're getting some luck with trash drops, this is not going to have too much demand. Ancestral Ring of Conquest is actually a deceptively good ring. This is pretty much a strong prio for feral DPSs as well as arms warriors and ret paladins because they often need to drop hit and they scale pretty well with primaries, especially feral. It's also pretty good for prot warriors seeking to find some joy on threat, but sadly prot warriors really do struggle to scale, so this is more of a footnote than adding them to the prio. They're just a decent candidate essentially. The Seal of Danzalar, not too relevant for PvE, but it is a pretty solid PvP ring, so maybe not a Void Crystal. Now, Earring of Soulful Meditation, this is obviously just priests, and it is fantastic, to be honest. So, go priest here. You might want to nitpick based on Circle of Healing or IDS, depending on if you have 2 Holy Priests or just the 1. I've heard that Circle of Healing priests are going to lean towards Eye of Gruul, though this is really close in most scenarios. So overall, this is going to go to any priest, but maybe you go improve Divine Spirit Priest first, but it is what it is. Just a great priest trinket. Libram of Absolute Truth, just not worth it. Pretty much like the Regrowth Idol. Mallet of the Tides, slam dunk prot warrior Abyss. No one else needs it, no one else wants it. It's really good though. So straight to your prot warrior, Bob's your uncle. This brings us to Leotheris the Blind and the Orca Hide boots I discussed just a moment ago. These are just shy of the Kazakh boots, and they are the best boots for all 3 healer specs, assuming they don't have those world boss boots. The spirit value gives Resto Druids an edge here, so you probably want to go Resto Druid first, just for that little bit of min-max if we're really, nitpicking. But overall, BIS for all the healers, assuming they don't have world boss loot available. Now we're on to Coral Barbed shoulder pads, and provided they do not break any set bonuses for your Resto Shaman or Holy Paladin for Phase 1, they are very nice. In particular for Holy Paladin, they're quite close to BIS. However, your Resto Shaman is probably going to be attached to that elemental 2-piece bonus if they're really min-maxing. So overall, you're going to go Holy Pala here first, just because Holy Palas can get away with wearing them and they're very close to tier 5. But overall, pretty good for Resto Shaman too, though they're probably locked in on that tier 4 2-piece elemental bonus. True Aim Stalker Bands, these are pretty good braces for hunters and enhancement shamans. They are either BIS or close to BIS depending on exactly the setup you're running. I would lean ever so slightly to your enhance here because you probably want to go Vamp Braces of Ending first on your hunters, but it's give or take. You can go either way here, it's super close, but those are the 2 specs that you really... But generally speaking, you can't go wrong here. Both specs will use these pretty well, and they're very close to BIS, if not BIS. This brings us to Girdle of the Invulnerable. It's a good belt, very defensive, but maybe part of a very good uncrushable setup for paladins. That said, it's quite widely viewed that it's better to use the crafted belt of the Guardian. Prot warrior wise, this is good, but unlikely to be part of the BIS setup since the offset PvP pieces for resilience often feature thanks to the strength of shield block for uncrushability. Now we're on to Tsunami Talisman, and it's big ticket in terms of it's a trinket and people want it, but it's 100% overstated in how good it is. So do take that in mind, right? We're going to be, this is going to be wanted by many, but it is a little bit, talked up way higher than it actually is. So it's essentially a better Hourglass of the Unraveler with similar negatives in terms of internal cooldown and proccing off crits only. That said, it's the second best trinket for many specs behind DST, and as such has a lot of demand as mentioned. If you sat through my slog of a phase 1 video, you already know that DST prio involved trade-offs with Tsunami Talisman prio, and this is where I'm going to start. I made one particular error because the information I had at the time wasn't perfect, and that error is that Ret Paladins do not want this trinket at all. They literally just don't want it. So Ret Paladins should be more involved in DST than I initially put out in that phase 1 video. And in this case, with Tsunami, they just don't want it, so they're out, okay? With that said, it's fair to say that the DST shuns specs get a bit more love here, aside from Ret, because Rets just don't want it. Feral Druids are near the higher end of the discussion here for this reason, as are Arms Warriors. It's not too far away from DST for threat as Bear, and is straight bis for Feral DPS, but not by a large margin, and the same can be said for all specs. The only curveball as far as Feral is concerned is that they are releasing Badge of Tenacity one phase early. So with that unanticipated change, it weakens the claim of your Druid if they are your main tank or primary off tank. You know, if they're not doing cats, you know, if they're not DPSing a whole bunch of the time, this does fall off a little bit. Brooch and Badge of Tenacity is pretty strong as a combo, and Tsunami Talisman is at best a small improvement. So overall, this is going to go to your cats, but not really your bears on average, but bears can use it pretty good. Your Arms Warriors have been shunned a bit on DST most likely, so they're going to be near the top as well. So overall, in a sort of guild management trade-off with the DST situation, I would place Monocats alongside Arms at the top of the priority here, with Feral off-tanks being sort of in that moderate, prior, middle sort of range. A big notable thing though is that if you own DST, you should probably, like, you know, forego this for a little while anyway, regardless of your spec. In terms of rogues, a real quick note, they prefer Warp Spring Coil and have a high DST prior, so they're just completely gone, just like Ret Paladins. That leaves us with Enhance, Hunter and Fury Warriors. To break this trio down, I do need to touch on one thing once again, and it's a bit of a long-winded thing, but it is important to note, so bear with me. It appears that most sims were simming DST wrong, and potentially still are. Uptime is just too high. Particularly, the Warrior Sim was, in early July, twice as much uptime as it should be, and that was since acknowledged and changed by the author of the sim tool. But the uptime for all class sims is suspiciously close to that of the original Mistaken Fury sim, which suggests most sims are quite a bit off on DST's actual DPS contribution, though I think the Enhance and Hunter ones have also been fixed now. This is not shots fired. Sim tools are very hard to create. I'm just highlighting some of the difficulties faced with DST simming. With this DST difficulty in mind, and assuming you haven't been blessed with loads of them, I'm going to assume most of your Hunters and your Fury do not have DST still. If this is the case, those two would be my personal choice for next recipients after the Feral and or Arms player, with anyone with DST being lower down the priority by default, just simply because it's not that big to pick up Tsunami over Brooch. And these DST owners are only ahead of Ret and Rogue, who simply do not want this trinket at all. This then leaves us with Enhance, and the main reason I'm unfortunately very low on my blue boys is that Dark Moon card Crusade is releasing early, much like Badge of Tenacity. This is actually a bit better for them than Tsunami Talisman for Enhance, and as such, you would ideally want your Enhances to grab the Dark Moon deck instead, putting them lower on Tsunami Talisman. It's worth noting though that if the Shaman in question isn't going to get DST for some time, they are not a bad Tsunami Talisman recipient. It's just how the context is, and unfortunately I can't provide you with too much reason to go Enhance here unless you're just not going to give them a DST anytime soon. To summarise though, Monocat equal to Arms at the top, followed by non-DST Hunters and non-DST Furies, followed by your Feral off-tank and non-DST Enhance, followed by DST Owners, followed by your Feral main tank, because they're going to struggle to get Tsunami this value, because they'll be using Badge, maybe Brooch, potentially 2 Chomp Trinkets, depending on content, blah blah blah. And then your Ret and Rogue, who just shouldn't be anywhere near this. Okay, so from one big ticket item to another one, and this has a little bit of a caveat, and again I'm trying to just express some thoughts on guild management as a whole in this one as well, because there is some contention here obviously. So it's a pretty big item, but it's not crazy big over the phase 1 Bis Sword, right? or if they have the dagger. This is a little tough though due to the paladin factor, and I did allude to this in phase 1, but your prop paladin is going to have a far bigger role in your Serpent Shrine and to a lesser extent Tempest Keep raid experience, compared to phase 1 at least, and this warrants the additional threat of a raid weapon provided they haven't grinded arenas, which most won't, let's be real now. Paladin representation is super low, and obviously Protodin just isn't a arena spec anyway. So don't jump out your chair real quick, I'm not about to tell you to hard prio prop paladin here, but you will want to make sure your prop paladin has a raid weapon pretty early into phase 2 for the threat boost over the reputation sword, and that can either be a pre-phase 2 hard prio for your prop paladin on the final Bloodmaw Magus Blade, with the notion that it's to ensure that your mages and warlocks are the first to get Fang of the Leviathan, which is probably what I would suggest. Or you can simply say, as phase 2 starts, the next spell damage sword to drop, Bloodmaw or Fang, goes to the prop pala to get that hurdle out of the way, and you let RNG decide. Perhaps your casters will prefer that. Whichever way you choose is probably fine, but it is going to be more significant to consistent raid success, especially in those early weeks, to make sure your prop paladin has that little boost on their sword, whether that's Bloodmaw or the Fang. With that said, once the prop pala thing has been sorted, in terms of pure class merit, there is no priority amongst your mages and warlocks unless PvP is a viable route for some of the recipients. Strictly speaking PvE, it's slightly better to have your warlocks and fire mage to grab the season 2 spellblade as it has hit on it rather than crit, with a tiny bit more spell power than Fang. However, assuming that is not the case, and for the vast majority it's just not the case, there is no way to differentiate between your pumpers based on class or spec. The lack of PvE one-hander with hit on it means that for most guilds, you should just go for the contextual factors that this video cannot know about your raiders. Biggest numbers, biggest dedication, biggest wait for an upgrade, etc. Go with that stuff or narrow it down to a couple and roll between a few of the better candidates. This brings us to the first tier 5 token, and that is the champion token. So, Paladin, Shaman, Rogue, only 3 specs will use tier 5 gloves as their BIS, and those are Rogues, Prop Paladins and Enhancement Shamans. In particular, Rogues and Enhancement Shamans get a good 4-piece bonus from their tier, whilst Prop Paladins can use Royal Silvermoon Gauntlets as a strong alternative meanwhile. As such, I would prio Rogues here and Enhance because they're looking for that 4-piece, followed by Prop Pala because it's more of a filler slot for them. For the Defender token, it's not too dissimilar to tier 4. Ferals get a lot of juice from this tier, itemization wise, and are the strongest candidate on gloves by a decent margin. Rest of the druids will still prefer Mitts of the Tree Mender, whilst boomkins that do not have tailoring will want these too, but just not to the same extent as Feral, as it's mostly used for the 4-piece bonus and is pretty much the worst of the 4 pieces that boomkins use. As such, you'd want your boomkin to get these as the 4th piece rather than first off, as they are pretty mediocre without the bonus. With that said though, we've got our warriors, and neither spec is very interested, with several better options elsewhere, even from phase 1. In terms of shadow priests, they prefer the Magtheridon gloves, whilst the itemization also just not being too hot in general. Spell hit just isn't all that for shadow priests, right? And the holy priest gloves are only an ever so slight upgrade on the Ataman gloves, so whilst they want these, they're not incredibly fussed by them. So you're probably looking at your feral, followed by your boomkin, followed by your holy priest, followed by whoever else that wants them, right? It's just the gloves aren't that great. Now the hero token. Hunters use these as BIS for 4-piece, whilst based on current sims, it seems that fire mages wants to use these for 4-piece alongside Vestments of the Sea Witch as their top off-piece. For Arcane though, they're going to prefer Gauntlets of the Sun King as their 5th piece, and as such forgo this token, but the 2 items are fairly similar. As it stands, Warlocks will want to use Spellfire if fire, or Tier 4 if shadow for 2-piece Tier 4 bonus, as far as I'm aware. Another caveat here though, and it's a very big one that we're going to see across all the tier tokens, is that hunters are going to use Beastlord all the way up to when they have all 4 pieces of tier 5. You do not break Beastlord at any stage until you have all 4 pieces. So you have to make a decision on whether you're hard prioritizing one hunter at a time or just straight up going mages first. I personally think mages first just makes a bit more sense, especially with the extra tokens we're getting, right? We got more RNG protection, we're going to get way more tokens, more tier pieces. Go mages first, it just makes more sense. They can equip it right away for the immediate boost, essentially, in most scenarios. So, in this case, I would lean Fire Mage first, because they're going to use those as their 4-piece, and can probably use them pretty quickly. We've then got our Hunters, because they do need to get their 4-piece, it's just that they can't equip it yet. And Warlocks don't really need it. You can also go Arcane here as a slightly lower priority if you haven't got any good, RNG on Gauntlets of the Sun King. This brings us to Fathom-Lord Karathress. And first off, we've got Soul Strider boots, and here we've basically got hard Holy Priest prio. They're a very nice BIS upgrade over the Iran boots, whilst other healers can focus on Orca hide boots. Besides Priest, you would go Wrestler Druid just because of the spirit factor, but essentially all the other healers want the leather Orca boots that we've just seen, and they'll just go anywhere else for the time being once your Holy Priests have these. Next up is Bloodsea Brigand's Vest, and it's a very, very nice off-piece, and as mentioned, this forms one of the BIS setups for Rogue, which I encourage you to focus on. I would largely say that you should ignore the shoulder pads setup and go for the Bloodsea Brigands setup for your Rogues. And given that this aspect reduced Rogue's claim to shoulder pads overall, we're going to put them ahead of other recipients. They are the primary recipient, and they get mad value from hit all the time. So essentially, Rogues first, but besides Rogue, this vest is also either BIS or exceptionally close to BIS for your DPS warriors, particularly Fury. So whilst I am still kind of waiting, keeping an eye out on the warrior sims and sort of essentially what they decide is their best setup possible, I do think it's looking likely that these off pieces are the way forward, and as such you're going to go DPS warriors next. Following rogues and warriors though, there's a distinct drop off. Don't get me wrong, still fantastic for enhanced shamans that lack tier 5 chest, and for rep pallers that are going to live with the hit rating because hit's hard to drop. But either way, most of those specs have alternatives they prefer. Enhanced wants tier 5, rep pallor wants tier 5, or Krakenheart breastplate. So as such, it's a clean rogue, fury warrior, then potentially your arms if they can utilize the hit, but I think it might be BIS regardless of the hit situation, followed by the rest essentially. Frayed Tether of the Drowned. It's a solid warrior neck. It does form part of your BIS depending on exactly the setup you're going. There's an arena BIS and a non-arena BIS. I believe this is featured in the non-arena BIS list, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But it's not going to go to your prop pallor, and Feral Druid is far, far away from this. They definitely don't want that. But overall, it's not a big ticket item. There's a lot of case to use the PvP neck for both, prop warrior, Feral Druid, and prop pallors are probably going to squeeze in a spell damage neck, I want to say, but the hit rating's not too big for them, and they'll go for other options regardless. Fathom Brooch of the Tidewalker. This is just not good. Void Crystal. This brings us to Sextant of Unstable Currents. Now, this is a pretty good trinket, but for seemingly all casters does not surpass the phase 1 options. I do want to put a quick note here though, because pre-phase calculations are not always 100% correct, and sometimes things do change. From my experience on private servers, Elemental Shamans had a lot of success with this trinket alongside Lightning Capacitor. Now don't get me wrong, I know private servers often had lots of trinkets wrong, I'm fully aware, but at the same time it was really good. So if anywhere, try it out on your Elemental Shaman, especially if they haven't got lucky with Quagmoran's Eye, and just see where it goes. As such, I would put it on your Elemental Shamans first here if there's no real big demand from somebody else, because I have a sneaking suspicion this might be better than what Sims say it is, but you know, maybe I'm wrong. Either way, it's an okay trinket, apparently not BIS for anybody, but on private servers Elementals had a lot of joy here. World Breaker. This is essentially just a solid PvP mace. It's not Stun Herald, but if you have an Arms Warrior seeking to dip their toe into Arena or perhaps even a Rep Pala, it's solid, but PvE wise, not really a big deal either way. And this brings us to the tokens for the pants. And the champion token has again 3 specs that want tier 5 pants for their BIS setup. And these are rogues, prop paladins, and enhancement shamans. So in terms of enhancement, they're really looking for that 4-piece bonus as our rogues. And this is essentially where we have to start differentiating. The noteworthy differentiation between these two is that the pants are particularly bad for rogue standalone. They are going to use them as their 4-piece regardless, but they just don't add up compared to skulkers until you have all 4 pieces. So essentially, rogues don't really want these until it's their 4th piece, if you can make it work like that in an ideal situation. On the flip side, you've got Enhance, who really want 4-piece, and these legs are pretty strong standalone also. So you're probably going to lean Enhance here too. Prop Paladins also are very interested in their legs. The block value is a little bit iffy. It's not an awful stat, but it's just not a fantastic stat either. So whilst you would probably go Enhance followed by Prop Pala followed by Rogue, you could maybe switch it up between Prop Pala and Rogue based on your own discretion. It's more of the bonus isn't that big a deal. Prop Palas just want it for itemization. Rogues want it for 4-piece, but it's the worst piece of the 4. And Enhance actually get, 4-piece is really big for them. And also this is a piece that's actually pretty good. So Enhance first. You can debate between the 2 other specs, but I would lean Prop Pala second just because rogues really won't equip these until they have 4-piece. So moving on to the Defender token now. There are 4 specs that want this one: Feral Druid, Shadow Priest, Holy Priest, and Prot Warrior. Once again, I would just about lean Feral Druid here. It is certainly the large upgrade, especially if we're talking feral tanking. However, it's not like tier 4 where it makes no sense to go anywhere else. You can go anywhere here, of the 4 specs at least, based on other merits, without committing any cardinal sins of min-maxing. But if you really want to min-max, Feral does have a slight edge here. It's just a really big upgrade. The effective point value is just super high. Shadow Priests get a reasonable upgrade here and want it as part of their 4-piece bonus with Magferodon gloves as their 5th piece, so I think it makes sense to go Shadow next. It's not like they get much priority elsewhere, so you may as well give them a bone here. Regarding Prot Warrior and Holy Priest, I think it's pretty close. If you're a tank prio style guild, I guess Prot Warrior, but I wouldn't opt for this because both specs aren't getting a huge upgrade over the Neverspite pants or Curator pants respectively, so I guess just flip a coin between those 2. It's not huge for either of those. So Feral, Shadow, followed by Holy Priest and Prot Warrior. For the hero token, it's a very similar story. All 3 are pretty good, but the Warlock pants are, not really going to make it in terms of the 4-piece bonus. Doesn't appear to be of interest. There is still a question mark exactly how it works, but it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. So they have a similar value to Spellstrike or Kazakh pants, so you're going to pass over your Warlocks here. Hunters want to use the leggings of Murderous Intent for their 5th piece, so they're just out, and that leaves you with your mages. Both mage specs will want these as their 4-piece bonus, but differentiating between the 2 probably comes down to if someone's getting a 2-piece or someone's finishing their 4-piece, whatever it is. If they're both not on a bonus yet, I don't know, whoever hasn't got loot or something, other factors. But generally here, mages first. Hunters just don't want it. Warlocks can make use of it if they are, sort of trying to tweak things around compared to Spellstrike. This then brings us to Morrogrim, and the first Morrogrim item is a cloak that doesn't look crazy, but it's a tiny bit ahead of Vengeance Wrap for pretty much all the Vengeance Wrap users apart from Hunters, because they don't use Strength, obviously. The cloak situation is a weird one. It's really close between Vengeance Wrap, Thalassian Wielder Cloak, and this one for a lot of specs for Feral, Enhance, Ret Pala. Hunters do have a slightly more clear picture on the cloaks, which we'll get to see a little bit later on. But here, you're going to want Feral DPS first because they scale the best with primaries. It's just a little bit better on Feral, followed by Rets, and you can go Enhance here too, but Enhance are probably going to go from Vengeance Wrap to Thalassians. It's pretty close either way though. All three of those specs can utilize this cloak really well, but I would go Feral first because it's slightly better there. A quick note though, you really don't want your Ret Pala to be on Thalassian. It's depending on how often you sim. If you spam the sim button, you can get slightly different results on Thalassian, and it sometimes sims lower than Razor Scale Battle Cloak. And given the contest station on Thalassian Wielder Cloak, just go here for the Ret Pala. Just go here. So to summarize, Ferals followed by Rets, but it's very close, and Enhance are a good candidate as well. Warriors can use this, but Vengeance Wrap I believe is slightly better on average. Illidari shoulder pads. Now this is a solid item, but very much a catch-up item for a less geared toon. Don't think too hard on this one. Go for anyone that gets a nice upgrade from it. It's pretty good. Next we have Gnarled Chestpiece of the Ancients. Similar to the previous item, not awful. This one's definitely not as good as Illidari. It's more of a catch-up piece, but going to be a Void Crystal more often than not. Mantle of the Tireless Tracker is literally a crystal. It's just not worth it. So we're going to move on to Girdle of the Tidal Call. And it's not an instant crystal. It's okay for Enhance, but it's pretty poor compared to most tier 5 options and the Groll Belt for Enhance. So if you've got an Enhance that hasn't got phase 1 Bis or didn't get lucky with the Groll Belt, it's okay for now on them, but don't hold it against them. It's not that good. It has many better alternatives in tier 5, so it's useful to an extent, but mostly a Void Crystal as you progress through the weeks. Then we've got Pauldrons of the Argent Sentinel, more of a catch-up item for Holy Paladins, around about the same value of as tier 4 Shoulders, give or take, assuming that you value the spell crit. Some Palas don't, but overall, it's just a catch-up item. It will be a crystal pretty quickly, because tier 5 and Coral Barbed are quite a bit better. War Boots of Obliteration next. These are awesome for plate DPS, but Retribution Palas have slightly better or equivalent options in Cobra Lash boots and Star Strider boots, and as such, you should prioritize your warriors strongly here. Hard prio warrior here, but they're very good on Ret Pala also. Pendant of the Lost Ages. It's a PvP item. I'm not sure if it actually is genuinely good for PvP, but as far as PvE is concerned, crystal it. Ring of Sundered Souls. This is a very good ring. Whilst prop palas haven't got a consensus bis list or, a simulation, I do think this is going to end up as the best prop pala ring alongside a spell damage ring. It's just nice stamina, got defense, got dodge, helps you get uncrushability in quite an efficient manner, especially with that extra chunk, and allows you to equip spell damage elsewhere. I think this is going to end up in the bis setup. I could be wrong, but I would go prop pala first here. It's pretty good on your prop warrior too, but they are desperate to find threat options in that ring slot as far as prop warrior concerned. Your feral tank just doesn't want this, so ignore them completely. This brings us to Band of the Vigilant. Now, it's a crystal as far as PvE is concerned, but maybe someone wants to use it as a PvP item. I'm not sure quite how good it racks up with the lack of intellect, lack of spirit, but it doesn't look too bad for PvP, so maybe there. Alright, so now we're on to Serpent Coil Braid. Now, the perception of this one from private servers is a lot higher than what the sims have put it at. To be clear, current sims put it at below Quagmorant's eye and icon of the Silver Crescent. Now, The big thing here is that it's controllable, right? When you use your mana gem, you get a big boost of spell damage, and you get to decide when that is. You also get more mana from your mana gem, which is, somewhat relevant, especially for Arcane. Now, in terms of the priority here, if you value that controllability, apparently it's within 3 DPS of Quagsire, so I'm assuming with the controllability aspect and the practicality, it's probably on par or slightly better than Quagsire. I certainly would at least go into early phase 2 with that assumption. Whether that actually holds out to be true longer term, we'll see. But getting to the differentiation between the two specs, Arcane maybe gets a slight nod here. All your mages might be Arcane, and in that case, other merits. But I think Arcane has a slightly better, a slightly better claim here because they get more mana. Mana's a bit more finite, or a lot more finite for them. But apparently it's a tiny bit worse than Quagsire. So we'll see. Really good trinket though, I think, and controllability is very powerful. This brings us to Talent of Ashara. And as it stands, which is to say, people are not sure of what the proc rate of Rod of the Sun King is, this outperforms Rod of the Sun King as Rogue main hand and Fury offhand, as it stands under current assumptions, but the proc rate is unknown on Rod. Part of me is suspicious that Rod will have a surprisingly high proc rate, but for now, I would have to say this is probably best to go Rogue first and then Fury offhand afterwards. But given that you're probably running one of each, maybe two, it's just not that big either way. It is their best option though for main hand and offhand respectively though, so at least give it some consideration, use other factors, etc. But Rod might surprise everybody. Moving now on to Luminescent Rod of the Naru. This is just a flat out holy prio, only class that uses it, or only spec rather that uses it. Really, really good. Now we're on to Lady Vashj, and this is just big item city, give or take. So brace yourselves. Vestments of the Sea Witch. Now this is an insane robe. This is literally a wet dream for your warlocks and your fire mages. Specs like Arcane, Shadow Priest get less value on the hit, and whilst Elemental view this as BIS, and it is just so good for warlocks, fire mages, and even Elemental Shaman, Elemental doesn't utilize the hit. Just doesn't. So it loses a lot of value in Elemental. That's why I was talking up Hateful Echoes very, very much for Elemental, because it's very close if you just delete the hit line from this item. So how are we differentiating? Well, obviously the Elemental factor, go Hateful Echoes until there's no one left to go vestments on, essentially. Unfortunately for Elemental, it's a small downgrade, but Hateful Echoes is very close. In terms of the Warlocks though, I do dislike using class spec for items like this, alongside obviously the fire mages too. But if you feel the need to do tiebreakers on class on an item like this, there are some factors to consider. Fire Warlocks typically have the Spellfire 3-piece bonus prior to attaining this. This robe is worth breaking the bonus, but because the bonus exists, it's less of an upgrade compared to a Shadow-based Warlock than a Fire-based Warlock. The same is true of Fire Mages. On top of this, as we mentioned, Elemental Shamans do waste a hit rating, and they have that close option Hateful Echoes. Because of all these things, lean towards your Shadow-based Warlocks, followed by your Fire-based casters. Elementals are a strict last prio here. It would be quite egregious to go Elemental over Warlocks or Fire Mage here, just because of that hit factor. There's no slight to Elemental, but overall Hateful Echoes is just way too close to vestments to warrant not giving this to your Warlock or your Fire Mage. So overall, Shadow-based Warlocks just about, then your Fire Boys. That's pretty much it. Rune Totem Mantle, a pretty good catch-up item, roughly equivalent to Tier 4 Shoulders for Resto Druid, perhaps a tiny bit better. So it's a good piece, but not important. Resto Druid Pro here, since Coral Barbed shoulder pads exist, as a better catch-up / awesome item for Shamans and Paladins. Now, I'm dreading this one. We're on to Belt of 100 Deaths, and this is, I would say, even worse than the DST situation. This is just, It's bonkers. The item is bonkers. It's BIS for pretty much all recipients that want it in Phase 3, as well as Phase 2. And that includes Phase 4 as well, because you don't get an upgrade in terms of eye level in Phase 4. So we're pretty much talking BIS till Sunwell on this belt for the recipients. And that's why it's so tough. Let me put that out there. This is really tough. And it is, again, another item where I would very, very much encourage you to use different factors, right? I'm saying that now so you don't behead me after I explain my thought process here, right? But in terms of if we are nitpicking, if we are feeling the need to be this, egregious in our min-maxing, there are some thoughts I have that sort of differentiate a bunch of these specs. So let's start with who it's actually wanted by. This belt is BIS for Feral Druids of both types, Enhanced Shamans, Rep Paladins, all 3 Warrior specs, Rogues, and even Hunters technically. First off, fuck Hunters on this. It is technically BIS, but it's something so tiny compared to the second best option that it really warrants a complete ban on Hunters receiving this item. Honestly, despite it being technically the best option, if your guild tag is on a hunter that has this belt equipped, people will meme the hell out of your guild. Don't do it. Even though it's technically BIS, just don't do it, please. Don't do it. Okay, that's the only easy rule out we have here. So, now that we've got it out of the way, the remaining specs all use this to Sunwell. Big problem. Now, nitpicking. The first area I want to talk about is the crafted options, the bind on equip raid patterns, and this is namely in the form of Red Belt of Battle for the Plate Boys and Belt of Deep Shadow for the Leather Boys, which are BOE from Tier 5 patterns as mentioned, and they are the first thing to consider because they are the closest alternatives even in Phase 3 for some. In particular, in the case of DPS Warriors and Rogues, these 2 belts are a lot closer than they are for the other specs. Red Belt of Battle for your Warriors, Belt of Deep Shadow for your Rogues, a lot closer than the other option than they are for other specs compared to Belt of 100 Deaths. So this, unfortunately, if you're nitpicking, puts them lower. It just has to. It's just the gap is smaller for those 2 specs in particular, or those 3 specs I should say. Sorry to Arms Warriors, kind of like, had a brain fart there. The 3 specs, it's less big for them. Even though it's huge, it's still huge. It's just not quite as huge as for the other ones, right? That's where I'm going. This then leaves Rep Pala, Enhanced Shaman, Prot Warrior, and Feral. Rep Pala and Enhanced Shaman get the highest prio on shoulder pads, at least based on what I've described so far in this video, which is already a big ticket item and something I'm sure they are delighted with given the level of competition. Alongside this, Prot Warrior and Feral have that tank factor, and to be honest, I do think if you are splitting hairs like this, and again I'm going to reiterate, this is splitting hairs, this is not clear cut at all, main tank priority makes some sense. Whether that's your Feral or your Prot Warrior, the initial pull is often the most scuffed time for threat due to potential parries, dodges, misses, etc. and can be the reason a pull goes wrong or ends in a wipe, and stacking expertise is literally the best way to remove the frequency of that RNG on your opening threat. You can also make a case for your second tank also, since there can sometimes be simultaneous pickups in certain fights where both tanks are going to want that initial RNG safeguard. To put it bluntly, misdirect only goes so far when you've got a horde of trigger happy spellcasters about to arse blast the boss and you've got dodge parry as your first 2 globals, right? It doesn't go far enough. So overall, that small factor does kind of prioritize your first 2 tanks, in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying you go 3rd tank, 4th tank. That's excessive. That's taking the tinky winky, So don't get me wrong. I know how controversial tank prio can be. And again, I implore you to use other context. Class is a very small part to play on this belt, in my opinion. But if we are doing class-based differentiation, I think you do have to lean towards your tanks, especially your main tank. The guy who's or person rather, that is always going to be, basically pulling the boss in nearly every scenario. That person really does want the expertise. They're not going to replace it till Sunwell. It's fantastic. So for me, if we're really splitting hairs, Feral Tank equals to Prot Warrior, assuming they are your main tank, followed by your off tank, which is probably your Feral Tank, potentially your Prot Warrior. Your Prot Pal is nowhere near this, in case that wasn't clear. Then you've got your Enhance, is equal to your Rep Pallies and equal to your Monocats. Monocat has a pretty good claim here too, but ultimately, I don't know, you have to love them a lot to give them this belt if they don't tank at all. Followed by your Warriors and Rogues. But I do again want to mention this is really small margins. Nobody should be upset if a Warrior or Rogue gets the first belt. But this is where my mind is at if we're being super specific. Alright, tough one, small margins, but we're good, right? Let's move on now. Finally, let's get away from that one. Cobra Lash boots are pretty nice. They are a contested item, but it's got a pretty reasonable sort of thought process here compared to the belt at least. This is Hunter and Enhanced Bis, and Rep Pallas are very interested in these two as a close to Bis/Bis option depending on which exact setup you have. The notable thing here though is that because Rets have two alternatives of similar value in Star Strider boots and War Boots of Obliteration, they're kind of at the lowest prio of those three. And Enhanced, because they can utilize the hit rating on Boots of Utter Darkness if they are leatherworking, they're a little bit behind Hunters on the prio here. So Hunters are your main prio here. There are some, close-ish options for Hunter, but overall, you do want to put your Hunters first here, followed by your Enhance, especially if they're leatherworking. Your Enhance should definitely go second here, followed by Rets, but ultimately I wouldn't go Ret here unless literally nobody else wants them, because there are better or similar options / better options for Ret. Moving on to Kraken Heart breastplate now. This is a very good chest. It's not quite Bis for either Warriors or Rep Palla, but it's pretty up there. This is more than good enough for a Warrior to utilize until they can get Bloodsea Brigand's Vest after your Rogue or Rogues. Likewise, this is very close to tier 5 chest to the point where you're probably putting this on Ret as prio and letting the tier 5 chest go elsewhere in terms of min-maxing loot value. As such, small Ret prio here, but also, obviously Warriors want this if they don't already have Bloodsea Brigand's Vest, but they're probably going to get it relatively fast unless you have an army of Rogues. So generally, Ret first, followed by Fury / Arms Warrior, probably Fury first because the hit rating, kind of big one. But both the Warriors are going to want Bloodsea Brigands, I believe, anyway. Glorious Gauntlets of Crestfall, a really simple one. Still a really good item, but a really simple one. Holy Pal Abyss, moving on. This brings us to Ring of Endless Coils. Now, this is just essentially the best non-spell hit ring for most casters. I don't want to go too in-depth here because it would become about as nitpicky as Belt of 100 Deaths, but the item itself isn't good enough to go through all that hassle. Essentially, it's just a direct upgrade on Ring of Recurrence for most. Maybe you go low priority on Arcane because the lack of intellect is actually kind of like a thing for Arcane. So, maybe you go less there, but either way, think of it more as a can you fit the crit in and drop the hit? Stuff like that. You have to think like that when you're talking about this one because it's not especially huge. It is the best non-spell hit ring, but again, nothing crazy, just a solid upgrade. So go with more of like the gearing aspects. Don't use spec prio here. Maybe Arcane should be lower just because there is no intellect on it. We've then got Coral Band of the Revived, and this is Bis for all healers outright, but that big chunky 27 spirit does lean you towards, of course, druids and priests first. Nothing too crazy. Obviously other factors bear in when you've only got a slight class bias, but if you are nitpicking and there's two close candidates, go for the spirit guys first because that's quite a lot of spirit for a ring, as well as having absurd healing. So slight prior priest druid, but Again, bis for all. Don't go too crazy on this one in terms of class context. Prism of Inner Calm. This is, I think, just a crystal because essentially if you're looking to drop threat, the AQ trinket is just outright better, I believe. So let's move on. Fang of Vashj. Now, ironically, despite the dagger normalization for rage for warriors, this is actually a very good tanking weapon if you're getting bad RNG on Mallet of the Tides. So Mallet of the Tides is a lot better just because it's got normalized to 2.4, I think it is, as opposed to daggers being normalized, I think, at 1.8 or 2, something like that. Basically, it's just worse to use a dagger than a mace for a warrior. But if you haven't got Mallet of the Tides, this is very good still. So good in your prot warriors. I guess it's good for your dagger rogues if they exist. I literally haven't seen one. Apologies if that's you, but I assume this is super good if you're a dagger rogue, but it just doesn't seem to be a thing, I want to say. So moving on. Light Fathom Scepter. Now this is bis for everybody, and I did allude to this one before in the phase 1 video. Light's Justice got a prio to the Spirit Boys, and here, especially assuming everyone has Light's Justice from the Spirit Gang, you do want to lean towards your Shaman and Holy Palace first if you are min-maxing to literally the maximum, right? It's bis for all of them, and you know you should probably go on other factors, but because of the Light's Justice aspect, Light Fathom Scepter is probably the biggest upgrade to your Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin first, but it's not, you know, that important. It's just the best option outright. There are some interesting options for the Spirit Boys though, as they wait for this as well. So I would lean towards Resto Shaman, Holy Paladin, but just bis for all healers. This brings us to Serpent Spine Longbow, and this is just the best hunter item, or weapon rather, for this phase. It's outright just hunter bis. Go hunters. In terms of differentiating between specs, I would just go for merits. If your survival is a pumper, dedicated, etc., the value of keeping that survival happy versus the, you know, increase that BM gets slightly more over survival, probably not really a big deal either way. But hunters here, after that, I guess it's pretty decent for PvP, 17 stam, crit AP, but I don't believe it's the bis option for any PvE melee boys in their range slot. I believe that it was reserved for the Arcanite Steam Pistol. But this then takes us to the tier 5 token helms. The champ token has 4 candidates that view it as their bis. Prot Pala, Rep Pala, Rogues, and Enhancement Shamans. So, the weakest claim of the 4, we're going to start with Process of Elimination. The weakest claim is the Protodin, and this is because their tier 4 helm, which they likely have, is pretty close since the block value is a little meh overall, right? It's an okay stat, but it's a pretty meh stat, you know? It doesn't make a big difference. So if you were to ignore the block value for a moment, the difference is not stark. It's relatively small, so you would put them last of those 4 specs here. As mentioned, your Enhanced Shamans want to hold on to their tier 4 helm and shoulders for the 2-piece for as long as possible, so this is going to be one of the later slots. Essentially, you want the tier 5 helm to be the last of the 4 pieces, alongside perhaps shoulder pads of the Stranger to swap in over the tier 4 2-piece bonus. So ultimately this then puts Enhance in that 3rd slot. You could argue that their claim is actually worse than the Protodins, but because of the value of the 4-piece, I do lean towards Enhance over the Protodins first. This then leaves us with Ret and Rogue, and both get a pretty sizable increase from this slot, though for engineers, if you're a Ret Paladin engineer, the engineering goggles are better. Likewise, Rogues get a pretty substantial increase from their 4-piece, and this is one of the better slots to get. Now, the difficulty is that if they're running the tier 4 2-piece, this is typically with the helm and chest. So whether they can equip it right away is a question mark. I don't believe they can if it's their first piece, but overall the claim of rogues is probably more important because of that 4-piece aspect. But you could argue either way between Ret and Rogue here. Nobody will mind between the two. But maybe, if they're not engineers, go Ret, I guess. If they're engineers, go Rogue first. Unfortunately, Rogues do have that tier 4 awkwardness. But overall, Ret and Rogue first, followed by Enhance and Protodin. You could argue about switching around each two, the top two and the bottom two. You could switch those around based on your personal discretion or your loot council's discretion. But there is definitely a stark contrast between the two pairs. Alright, so the Defender token now, and it's a bit of a clown fiesta. All possible recipients want this. Yep, you heard me correctly. So maybe a good time to grab a coffee. As usual, when there's this level of competition, I gotta be pretty harsh. So first things first, every spec that isn't Feral Druid, that is engineering, should be bottom prio. The engineering goggles for all the specs bar Feral Druid are exceptionally close or better than tier 5. So just putting it out there, if you're engineering and not a Feral Druid, you're bottom here. It's just how it has to be because it's so contested. Following this, unfortunately, I've got a dunk on a spec that just isn't going to do too hot in terms of scaling, and that is Prot Warrior. It's not fair, but essentially, if Prot Warriors are super serious about trying to squeeze out any advantage they can, they're going to go Season 2 Helm here. Whether that's slowly grinding it, or whether that's respecking properly and having all the bells and whistles and grinding out points fast, that's your best bet. The problem as to why I think Prot Warriors have to be near the bottom of this prio here is because they just don't scale immensely well between the difference between their tier 5 helm and their phase 1 bis. It's just not substantial enough. It just doesn't really warrant it. It's the smallest upgrade, to put it bluntly. So Prot Warriors are bottom, only ahead of the engineers. You then have a sort of like awkwardness where DPS warriors, feral druids, rest of druids and holy priests all get a pretty substantial upgrade from this token, but none of them are super desperate for bonuses. And in particular, in terms of EP and differentiate between tanks, healers, DPS, that's more of a discretionary thing, right? In terms of how you view your overall happiness building. View your overall sort of approach to gearing up, whether you value the tanks first or like to take a more balanced approach. But generally speaking, you can loosely band those 4 specs together. There is one standout spec, and that is the Boomkin. So the Boomkin really wants 4-piece. It uses 4-piece tier 5 in phase 3 to the best of my knowledge. And essentially, this means that it's a big ticket aspect to get that 4-piece rolling on your Boomkin, and to some degree you're not really helping or prioritizing your Boomkin anywhere in nearly every phase. So to some degree this is both a really nice upgrade in terms of the helm slot, and also provides one of the better pieces on the way to 4-piece bonus. It's just one of those things where standalone Boomkins aren't fantastic DPS, but this is one of those cases where it just makes sense to go Boomkin first. They get a lot of value standalone. The 4-piece is great. They kind of want to rush that. So they get a nod over your ferals, over your DPS warrior, over your healers. I will note that if you're super min-maxy, you probably want to go Boomkin into feral, because feral just gets a lot of value from their tier 4 into tier 5. But again, so do the healers, so does the DPS warrior. So non-engineers, very contested. I'd go Boomkin first, Prot Warrior last, unfortunately, and then the remaining specs are kind of very discretionary. If you're really min-maxy, you probably go tank first, which would be your feral. This then brings us to the hero token. Now, once again, it's a very, very similar story. Hood of the Corruptor is fine, but just not used. Its tier 4 helm is typically going to be used, or the engineering goggles, depending on how that works out. If they're engineers, they'll use their goggles. If they aren't engineers, they're probably going to go tier 4 helm along with the shoulders or along with the gloves. One of those two to get the 2-piece. So they don't really need the helm here. In terms of the hunters, again, they need all 4 pieces for this to work out for them. So this then means that you're going to prioritize them less than your mages. Your mages have prio. In terms of, again, differentiating between your mages, maybe just choose who's got the next set bonus or who hasn't had an upgrade for a while, that kind of stuff. But mages first tier, followed by hunters. Warlocks not that interested in this token. So now we're on to the trash drops, but just before that, I am about to show you why I was AFKing here. I'm just going to this real quick. Nice little added value whilst I record this video. Yep, min-maxing all day, every day. But yeah, trash drops. Boots of Courage and Ending. Solid Holy Pala boots. They're not BIS, but they're pretty damn good. Pennant of the Perilous, as I've alluded to before, is your best neck for your rep palas and your warriors. I would lean warrior here first, just because you don't give them a nod many places elsewhere, and it's real nice. The crit is really valuable to them. Spyglass of the Hidden Fleet, not awful, but nothing spectacular. Whoever wants it, probably a Void Crystal most times. Totem, awful. It's in that regrowth, Holy Light, relic / idol sort of mold, so this is pretty much a Void Crystal. Wild Fury Greatstaff, this is the best option for your feral tank, assuming they are not PvPing. So the only differentiation here is if you've got a feral that is going to PvP for the Season 2 mace, you go for the guy who's not PvPing, or maybe will struggle or whatever. The guy who's not going to get Season 2 mace quickly or at all or whatever, you go that one first. But generally, this is a great staff. It's the best option as far as PvE sources are concerned for your feral tanks. Serpent Shrine Shuriken, this is actually your best non-PvP thrown item as a prot warrior. If you're doing arenas for arena points every week, the gladiator thrown weapons are a little bit better, but this is very, very nice and essentially takes that slot. Obviously, it's a thrown weapon, it's nothing crazy, but it's good. In terms of the patterns, now these drop in Tempest Keep as well. There are some standout ones. Again, in terms of the bind on pickup patterns, these are the ones you have to be a little more careful with, right? If they're crafted and can't be traded, then you're not getting that guild-wide benefit. So the belts are all BOE, so you can just go to like the most reliable person who's always going to be in your guild to craft for everybody for free, things like that. But the boots are the ones that you have to keep an eye on in terms of the individuals receiving them. And there are a few standouts. Boots of Blasting are really nice, really, really nice. Boots of the Long Road are also pretty good. They aren't the best option, they're just solid, so that's not as big ticket. Don't stress too much about those ones. Boots of Blasting do have BIS connotations depending on spec. I don't want to go through all these patterns individually in that respect, but these are really, really good, so focus on Boots of Blasting going to the correct person. Boots of Natural Grace, these are just about, depending on your perception and what else you can get regarding resilience, so Arena Mace for example, these are potentially the best option for your feral tank if they already have leatherworking, or if they want to pick up and drop leatherworking too. Boots of Utter Darkness, as mentioned with the enhanced stuff, very, very good for enhance. Not quite BIS, but very useful if they can craft these. Don't go anywhere but enhance with Boots of Utter Darkness. In terms of the rest of them, I don't think it matters. Hurricane Boots, not too great. The belts are BOE, so no problem. So those are the standouts. Just a quick rundown. Didn't script that bit, so apologies if it wasn't super clear. But that's Serpent Shrine Cavern. I'm actually going to pause the recording now because it's been a long one for Tempest Keep as part 2. So I'll see you then. Hope you found Serpent Shrine Cavern useful, and we'll get to TK very shortly in the next one.